Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar on .au Direct. I am Michael Lewis, auDA's Industry Relations Manager. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which I'm coming to you from today, the original home of the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Please note this session is being recorded. This is our fourth webinar we've held on .au Direct since it's launched. .au Direct launched on the 24th of March this year, and the priority allocation period for .au Direct recently closed on the 20th of September. We were really pleased with the strong community support and awareness for the benefits of this new namespace, and wanted to take this opportunity to update you all on how registrations have gone now priority allocation has ended. It's also a good opportunity to reiterate the strong protections that are in place to keep .au Direct and the domain a trusted and secure space, and outline some of the complaints and dispute processes that are available. I'll shortly hand over to Bruce Tonkin, auDA's Chief Operating Officer, who will cover this in more detail in this presentation before taking your questions. Before I do, I wanted to quickly take this chance to thank all the organisations and businesses and across industry, community and government that were involved in the consultation for .au Direct and the awareness raising. It was considered an inclusive process that ran over a number of years with a broad section of the Australian community. And wanted to particularly thank our .au registrars for their work in promoting the namespace and raising awareness. As you'll see shortly, it's yielded some amazing results. So thank you all who were involved. A reminder that if you do have any questions during this presentation, to please put them in the Zoom Q&A app, and we'll answer them towards the end. But without further ado, Bruce, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. As Michael mentioned, we've had a very strong uptake of domain registrations in .au Direct, so much so that we crossed the 4.1 million domain boundary last week. We're now the 7th largest country code domain name in the world, and we're just outside the top 10 top level domains overall, which includes sort of .com, .net and .org. We are ahead of France and Italy in terms of names under management, and the next nearest country to us is Brazil with 5 million names. Just as a reminder, .au Direct was introduced basically at as a result of community consultation that happened in 2015, and a community-led panel recommended to the auDA board that .au Direct be introduced. And then another community panel in 2017 gave advice and recommendations on how to implement it in terms of giving existing registrants the first opportunity to register their matching name. The main shift with respect to .com.au is our most popular domain namespace currently, and typically that requires an Australian company number or Australian business number to register. .au Direct also supports the ability for an individual or a natural person to register a domain name. They still need to prove their identity, and for most people that's a driver's license, but other forms of government IDs such as driver's licenses and birth certificates, etc. Can also be used for proof of identity. And the other option for an individual is to have an Australian trademark and to use the trademark number as their verification. So talking specifically about .au Direct numbers now, we've now had more than 650,000 registrations since the launch. And that now accounts for about 16% of all names in the .au domain. So it has been a very large take-up. This is a graph showing the data as of the end of September in green, and that's that area of green on the graph in the first couple of weeks of October is simply grown. And it's now sitting at about 16% of the whole namespace, And as you can see, it is now basically 3 times the size of NetAU, which would be the next closest namespace. Just comparing .au compared with other recent launches. So the United Kingdom.uk launched in 2014, about 8 years ago, and .uk accounts for about 14% of their namespace, and .nz launched in a similar time frame, and they're sitting around 20%. We're already at 16% after the first 6 months, so we look like our launches for this stage of the process is ahead of what we've seen in the UK and New Zealand. Looking at other regional country codes, particularly Singapore.sg and Japan.jp, they're much closer to sort of 50% or above. And they launched probably around 10 years earlier, around sort of 2005 timeframe. One of the things that's interesting in our process is that if there's more than one applicant for the same name and they've had those names since before February 2018, then they can remain in contention, and each party needs to agree before the name will get allocated. What we've ended up with is about 6,460 names as of the end of September that are in contention. And of those, the vast majority, in fact, 85% of those are in contention between just 2 parties. And in some cases, those parties are actually the same legal entity and will be able to resolve the contention themselves. And I think this sort of data basically fulfills what we had been telling people all along, is that for the vast majority of registrants, and in this case, more than 600,000 people that applied for their name were able to get their matching name without contention. Some of the questions we got asked in the lead up in the last few months is what's auDA doing about ensuring that the namespace as a whole continues to have a very low rate of cybercrime. This is basically the most recent data. Over the last financial year, we only had requests from enforcement bodies basically relating to information about domain names that related to about 0.002% of the namespace. We subscribe to DNS threat intelligent feeds from around the world where people can report a .au domain name that's being used in phishing or malware or some other form of attack. That amounts to about 0.03% of the names under management, and that stayed consistent since the launch of .au Direct in March. So the stats, if anything, have actually got better. The reason why we have a low level of cybercrime in Australia is with respect to the .au namespace, is that we have multiple layers of defence. The first layer is, unlike most other top-level names, we actually require that the registrars validate the registrant at the time of registration. And as mentioned, that can be company information like an ABN number or personal information such as a driver's license. auDA also does daily checks. We look for patterns of behaviour where we've seen malicious behaviour in the past, and we look for patterns of that malicious behaviour. And then we suspend domain names on a daily basis based on that behaviour. As mentioned, we also have subscribed to threat feeds from around the world for any names that are being misused. And mostly this is related to domain names where they've been registered for more than 5 years and the website has been hacked due to essentially because they haven't followed the ASD Essential 8 and their websites have not been patched with new updates to the software, and they become vulnerable. And the interesting thing here is that the other trend is, even though it's a low percentage, it's mostly targeting people outside of Australia, and they're leveraging the reputation of .au, and then they target people in other countries based on hacking those websites. And then finally, we have our complaints process, and people can lodge complaints about the eligibility of a domain name. One of the things that also came up recently was there was a lot of pressure being placed on people to, if they had an existing name, if they had an auDA or a ComAU, that they were being felt compelled that they needed to register their matching.au. The domain name space is actually designed so that completely separate organisations can hold each domain name. And we use an example here of ABC. So there's a NetAU, auDA, edu, and id.au. And you can see they're all quite separate legal entities. Some are not-for-profit, some are for-profit, and one is an individual. But the thing to point out is each of these domain names, abcnet.au, is not the same name as ABC auDA. They're both separate names, separate legal entities, and are both globally unique names. And it's similar really to the way humans are named in Australia. Typically, people have a first name and last name. A lot of people also have a first name, middle name, and last name. And that's how we distinguish humans. And the thing here, just like ABC can be a common label for a domain name, a label like Bruce, which is my name, is a common name, particularly if people of my age or a bit older. But we distinguish ourselves by having a middle name or a last name. And in my case, my full name is Bruce Archibald Tonkin, which makes me unique. There is more than one Bruce Tonkin, and there's certainly many Bruces. And with the ABC, there's many domain names that include the word ABC. And the second level middle name, if you like, could be a net or an org. And then some people can choose just to have abc.au, essentially a first name and a last name. And that's what the domain name space is designed to do. It's very much about making names that are easily remembered by humans, with the idea that each name is globally unique. Now I want to talk a little bit about the obligations, I guess, of a registrant and the mechanisms that we have in place to deal with people that are trying to misuse domain names. So firstly, when you sign up for a domain name license, it's a right to use the DNS for a period of time, commonly 1 year, but we also support 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, and 5 years. So it's a right to use the DNS system. You choose the identifier, so it's your choice of name. You need to provide information that's true, accurate, and complete. If we find that information being used to register a domain name is false, then that's grounds for cancelling the domain name. The domain name needs to meet our eligibility and allocation rules. For .au especially, that means that there's a validated Australian presence. And then finally, the registrant is warranting that in the use of their license to use the DNS, they don't use the license for any purpose that's unlawful, illegal, or fraudulent under Australian law. So with respect to providing false information and eligibility, you can, if anything is falsely registered or the person you believe is not eligible for a domain name, you can raise that through the auDA complaints process. We get a lot of questions about domain names that are being used for what's referred to as domain name monetisation. So firstly, domain monetisation is allowed in ComAU, NetAU, and .au direct. It's not allowed in the non-commercial spaces. So it's not allowed in auDA or edu.au, for example, or id.au. So it's specifically intended for commercial spaces. And essentially, domain monetisation means that the person is registering the name for the sole purposes of selling, leasing, or holding the applied domain name to generate revenue from the name. And it can include warehousing and registering a name for future resale. However, in doing that, it can't be unlawful, illegal, or fraudulent. So in real estate terms, it's basically roughly the equivalent of property developers that might own multiple properties. They might try and rent the properties. They might try and have advertising running on those properties, or they might try and build buildings on those properties and resell them at a higher value in the future. So really nothing illegal about having a portfolio of properties. Some examples of domain name monetisation, you'll quite commonly see generic words. So ladder.com.au is an example. If you visit that website, you'll see a list of advertising links, essentially. Also, you will see generic names, and these names that are used for domain name monetization are usually 2 or 3 letter acronyms, or they are common English words in the English dictionary, or they are common Google search phrases. So in other words, they're things that you would type into Google when you're searching for something. So if you're searching for surfing holidays, that would be a Google search term, and a domain investor might register a domain name like surfingholidays.com.au or .au and try and generate revenue from that website, generally through advertising. So that first category is a set of links with a generic word like ladder. Another is a person might build content, so they'll write news articles and take photos, etc., and basically make the site very interesting. But the cost of producing that site is basically ad revenue funded. And news.com.au is a simple example of that. So it's a well-known news website, which is ad funded. Domains can also be used to create directories. So lawyer.com.au, if you visit that website, you'll just simply see a series of categories of lawyers. And if you want a divorce lawyer, it'll provide you a list of divorce lawyers. The last most common use for domain names under monetization is what's referred to as search engine optimization, or SEO. And this is where you might have a small business website and you want to try and improve its ranking in search engines like Google. So a search engine specialist will often build separate websites based on generic domain names. And then those websites all link to the client's website and basically create the impression that there's a lot of people interested in that particular website, and hence it raises its search engine ranking. So all of those uses are perfectly reasonable. And there's many domain names that have been registered for 20 years or so that perform these functions. Now, as I mentioned, all registrants have an Australian presence and they are subject to Australian law. And I want to draw attention to 2 laws in particular. One is the Trademark Act of 1995, and the other is the Competition and Consumer Act of 2010. Within that second act, there's a section which is referred to as Australian consumer law. And a key statement in there is a person must not, in trade or commerce, engage in conduct that is misleading or deceptive or is likely to mislead or deceive. And there's a series of regulators in Australia. There's ACCC at the national level, which is generally dealing with sort of large national companies. And then there's state and territory regulators, which will typically regulate the behaviour of small businesses within that state or territory. Now, these laws are relevant with respect to domain name monetisation, mostly around what is sort of generally referred to as cybersquatting. So cybersquatting is the practice of registering a domain name of a well-known company, brand or personal name, or a name that's likely to be confused with one of those, in the hope of later selling it at a profit to the holder of the domain name. So this is the Oxford English definition. So it's one thing to register a name like ladder and have a website that's got some information about ladders. It's another thing entirely to register a domain name like Bunnings and try and trade off the reputation of the hardware store to try and sell ladders. I just want to be clear here that the cybersquatting, that definition, that's not consistent with Australian consumer law under either trademark law or Australian competition and consumer law. So when people approach us and they say, well, can we register domain names for the purpose of generating advertising revenue, then the answer for com.au, net.au and .au direct is yes, you can register a domain name like ladders.com.au, but the domain name should not incorporate an entity name, personal name or brand that exists at the time you register that name. And the domain name can't be used for cybersquatting or other misleading or fraudulent activity. Now, to deal with the cybersquatting does exist, and it comes and goes. And typically what happens is most of the more experienced, what we call domain name investors that have monetized domain names, they know the rules and don't engage in cybersquatting. But every now and then there's a new group of people that come along, and we're starting to see that a little bit in the last week or so, really, in .au, where there are people that are looking for brand names, registering them, mostly of large, well-known organisations, and then they contact them and say, look, we've registered this name for you, and we'd like you to buy it from us for some large sum of money. So back 20 years ago, auDA actually developed a dispute resolution mechanism that's been in place and it's been stable for 20 years, which is called auDRP, or the .au dispute resolution policy. And it was specifically developed to combat cybersquatting. And the idea here is that while there's these existing laws, trademarks law and competition and consumer law, going to court is an expensive process. So the auDRP was designed for small businesses to be able to take action against cyber squatters at a significantly lower expense. And these disputes are handled, we have two bodies that handle these disputes. One is the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, which is a global organization based in Geneva. And the other is a local Australian organisation, which is called the Resolution Institute. So you can choose from either of those providers. And essentially, if someone approaches you and tries to sell you back a domain name that incorporates your brand, you can initiate auDRP provided you meet 3 tests. The first test is that the domain name is identical or confusingly similar to a name, which could be your company name or business name or personal name, a trademark or service mark in which you've got rights. The second test is that the current registrant conversely doesn't have any rights or legitimate interests in respect of that domain name. And the third element is that the person you're complaining about has registered or subsequently used the domain name in bad faith. So using that Bunnings example I gave earlier, if somebody registered Bunnings.au, if their family name was in fact Bunnings and they were wanting to build a website to, I don't know, announce their latest wedding or something, that would be a legitimate right. But if it was somebody that just had a portfolio of names and they had no other rights in respect to that name, but the name was the name of a major brand, and they were using the name in bad faith, then that would be grounds for them to lose the domain name under the auDRP. So just to flesh out what bad faith means, so the first 2 tests are fairly obvious. You either have the rights to a name and somebody may not have legitimate rights in a particular name. Bad faith, it's a term of art that's really specific, has specific meaning in the domain name industry. And the auDRP defines bad faith and gives us several examples, and I've given 4 of them here. One sign of bad faith is the domain name has been, so it's a brand name and it's primarily been registered for the purposes of selling or otherwise transferring the domain registration to another person, or it's been registered to prevent the current owner of the brand name from registering the name and then trying to sell it back to them. So we see this with .au where people have obviously not been able to, or chosen not to apply for their matching .au, and then subsequently somebody registers it and tries to sell it back to them. That would be a sign of bad faith. If the domain name is used for the purpose of disrupting the business, so a classic example, someone registers a brand, puts a pornography site on it, and then tells the brand, you have to buy this off me or I'll just keep leaving the brand there with pornography, which might damage the reputation of their business. Or the last one is attempting to attract for commercial gain or creating a likelihood of confusion with the complainant's name or mark. So they create a name like Bunnings and they start generating advertising revenue for ladders. Clearly they're basically leveraging off the brand that's at the brand owner. So it's another example of bad faith. So the summary of that is, with any new namespace, there are perfectly legitimate opportunities to register names, which are usually generic. They're dictionary words or Google phrases, and you can build different websites on those, and they can be advertising funded. What you can't do is cybersquat, which is registering a brand name, for the purposes of trying to sell it back to that brand owner. We have an auDRP process that has built specifically to deal with cybersquatting, and that has 3 tests. Basically, one is that you actually have a legitimate right in the name that you're complaining about. The second test is the current registrant of that domain name doesn't have a legitimate right to that name. And the third test is that registrant has used that domain name in bad faith. And so putting this into sort of a real estate analogy, it's a bit like on the edge of a city, a government might release farmland for residential use. In any sort of new area of real estate, there will be sort of standard homeowners that want to buy a piece of land to build their first home. There will be real estate developers that will buy up probably multiple pieces of land. They want to build some sort of housing estate, and they want to develop the land. And then there will be people that are probably speculating and thinking, I'm just going to buy this piece of land, and I'm just going to dump asbestos waste on it, and hope nobody notices, but I'll charge lots of people to get rid of their asbestos waste. And then they find that's actually illegal, just as it would be if that block of land was in the middle of the city. Because even though it's a new piece of land, it's still subject to all the laws of the land. And .au, it's a new namespace, lots of new opportunities. We've basically got hundreds of thousands of new people and new businesses being created on .au, but there will be some people that will try and misuse the system. And we'll certainly be focused on ensuring that .au Direct has got the same reputation of .com.au with respect to it's a place you can trust and that there's no malicious activity underway. So at that point, I will stop and welcome to take any questions, Michael.
Thanks for that, Bruce. And yes, please do chuck your questions in the Zoom Q&A app there. I've seen a few have come through. I should say we'll try and answer Bruce, Bruce more so than me, but Bruce will try and answer the questions in general terms. But if you've got specific examples about domain names that you're complaining about or would like information about, that'd be best run through the auDA complaints process, which Bruce can touch on a bit more about too. But at least in general terms, happy to tackle a few of these. Bruce, I suppose that the first cab off the rank is, so if a name, if a com.au name was used for priority to register a .au direct name, and that name is subsequently sold, is the right to hold that .au direct name still valid?
Yeah, if we're talking about one of the 6,500 names that are still in contention, if one of the names that's part of that contention set is a com.au, and that com.au name is transferred to another entity, then their application for the .au direct transfers to that other entity as well.
Okay, and how is auDA verifying that registrants were eligible to register a .au direct name when matching during the priority period?
Yeah, so registrars had the role of validating the registrant. They needed to validate that the existing eligible domain, using a com.au as an example, that they're eligible to hold the com.au name, and they need to also validate that they are eligible for the .au name that they're applying for.
And I'm just trying to read through the questions as quickly as they're coming in. We had another question coming about a contested domain, and there are 2 parties in contention. So do they just remain in contention until it's resolved?
That's correct. Yeah. So an application for a .au name remains current until the 20th of September 2023. And nothing will happen to that name in that time until both parties agree. And then on the 20th of September 2023, the two parties, if it was two or if there was three or more, they can elect to effectively renew their application. Their eligibility will be revalidated, so just ensuring they're still eligible for the underlying .com.au or org.au or id.au, etc. name that they've used as the basis of their application. That will get revalidated in 2023. But from now until then, the application is valid and the parties are free to reach agreement through any mechanism they wish. The WHOIS information or the WHOIS website you can use to find the email contact address for the registrant. If the email contact address bounces or is invalid, then you can contact the registrar and ask them to update the email address to make sure that the email address is still working. The other thing, though, would be to look at the website of the other names that are contending, because most websites these days provide contact information in various forms, and that's probably one of the more easiest methods to get in touch with the other parties that are in contention.
All right, so to clarify, if you, before the 2023 deadline, you sell or transfer the domain or just are no longer eligible to hold it, you won't remain in contention.
Correct.
And does that carry over to whoever picks up the name after you? If you were to,
well, so if it's a .com.au name and it's sold, the license is sold, then the corresponding application is transferred along with the .com.au name, so that transfer applies. If, however, you let the name lapse and it expires and it's purged from the registry, and then a brand new person goes and registers the name, then that new person isn't part of that contention set.
And we had a question about if there are names in contention, they're not responding to any of your requests. Are there any next steps you can take?
No, look, I think it's just like any contact. I think a lot of time people tend to ignore emails, and if you seriously want to get in touch with people, your probably next choice would be to write a letter. As I say, most or many websites have contact information that you can use to write a letter to. Other methods of contact would be, if it's a company that's registered the domain name, that company will be registered with the Australian Security Investments Commission, ASIC. You can actually pay for a record for that company, and that record will include an address for service. And then you can formally write to that company using their formal address for service.
And we've had a few questions come in about what to do if other people have picked up a name that you'd like, and where disputes arise. So I might just settle up a minute. We'll try and answer them in a bit of a general sense, because there are a few different cases. And I will reiterate, if there are specific domains you do want additional information about, there is the auDA complaints information on our website, auda.org.au/complaints, which has more information about next steps. But on that, Bruce, would you just mind taking us through what the recourse is available? So what should be the first thing that someone should do if they would like to get dispute or question the eligibility of a domain that's been registered?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing is look at the registered name and see whether they are eligible for that name. And particularly what you're looking for is any information that looks false. So if the name is purporting to be registered by a major company, it's probably unlikely that their email address will be Gmail. If the contact name is Bruce Tonkin, then it's highly unlikely that their email address is some sequence of sequence of letters that looks like a foreign language at Gmail. So you look for things like that where it could be a false registration. You can lodge a complaint with the registrar on the basis that you don't think the registrant is eligible, or you think the information is false. If the registrar doesn't take action, you can escalate that to auDA. If you think that it's been registered on a cybersquatting basis, then you can contact either WIPO or the Resolution Institute to lodge an auDRP dispute against that holder of the domain name license.
And with the auDRP process, so how does that progress? So do you have to have raised a complaint with auDA before going through the auDRP?
It's an independent process that's specifically to deal with cybersquatting. You contact either WIPO or the Resolution Institute, formally lodge a complaint. What that does is triggers a process where they contact the registrar on your behalf, and the registrar will place the name into a lock, effectively stop any changes being made to that name. They also inform auDA, and we create a case in our system and we keep track of the case. If the dispute body finds in favour of the complainant, they have a couple of choices. They can actually have the name transferred to the complainant, which they'll generally do if the complainant is eligible for that name. And if the complainant's not eligible for the name, then they would advise that the name will be cancelled. Again, they will send those instructions to the registrar. If the registrar doesn't follow those instructions, then the complainant can escalate that to auDA, but that's pretty rare. So normally auDA just keeps a monitoring eye on it, because the dispute bodies pretty much work directly with the registrars, and the registrars comply with the decision from the dispute bodies. I should mention, though, that if you're in the position of being either the complainant or the respondent and you're unhappy with the decision of auDRP, you still have recourse to the Australian courts. And so you can notify within a time limit at the end of the dispute process and say, I don't like the answer, and I'm taking this case to court. And again, any changes to the domain name will be put on hold while that court case is decided.
No worries. Thank you for that, Bruce. Just had another couple of questions, just sort of clarifying the time frame for the priority hold. So does it matter when in the priority application period you applied for priority status? So for those names that are in contention, does the date depend on when you applied, or is it a fixed date?
Yeah, it's a fixed date, so it doesn't matter when you apply. The application is valid until the 20th of September 2023.
No worries. So they'll all come up again, and those applicants will be contacted.
Correct. Yep.
No worries. Sounds good. Just regarding auDA's monitoring of DNS abuse, would you mind quickly taking us through what steps you and the team take to monitor and track abusive domains that are both coming through now and have come through in the past?
Yeah, in terms of new names, we have a number of reports that are produced every day where we look for different types of behaviour, and also just new topical topics. So, for example, the Optus data breach, we've been keeping an eye on domain names that include the words or the letters Optus. When the current government announced that they were planning to do a referendum with respect to voice to the Parliament, we started to keep an eye on any domain names that include the word voice or Parliament. So we tend to look out for words that we think might get used for unlawful purposes. And mostly we're keeping an eye on the registration information associated with those to see whether they've been falsely registered. And if they've been falsely registered, we cancel the license. We also look for patterns for names that have unusual timing, if you like. So often when domain names are first expired and then they become available for re-registration, we keep an eye on those names that get re-registered, because again, they tend to be attractive to overseas companies for search engine optimization purposes, and they'll use false information to try and get a good .au name, essentially. So we keep an eye on that. So those are driven off daily reports. With the DNS abuse feeds, we have daily reports from organisations around the world where people can report abusive domain names. Generally, these are names that have been used to target people outside of Australia. So these agencies are spread all around the world, and we get a report of a name. We then look up the report and try and verify it. We never take action unless we can verify it. So typically for phishing sites, we're looking for the website that's actually a phishing site, and confirm that it's copying a brand, and then we would contact the registrar and ask them to take action. And if no action is taken, then we will suspend the domain name.
And, have you seen any increase in DNS abuse since .eu Direct's launch in
No, it's been fairly consistent, so no increase.
Is that comparable with what our colleagues have seen overseas in other direct namespace launches?
Yeah, I haven't heard any particular evidence from either the UK or NZ that there was any particular high incidence of abuse in .uk or .nz, for example. In fact, most of the abuse is still in .com.au because it's still seen as the name that has the most recognition by consumers. And so if somebody's trying to register a name for malicious purpose, they want to go for a name that's got the highest recognition by the user, and currently that's .com.au.
Well, thank you for that, Bruce. We're right up on time. I'll just share my screen because we have a few additional resources just to flag with everyone before we wrap up. So there is obviously auDA's website with fact sheets and blogs and the like. And let me know I'm not showing the right screen, Bruce, but I should have the presentation up.
Yeah, I can see it. Yes, as well.
So we've got fact sheets, blogs, and the like on our website. There's also resources on our .au registrar websites as well, which you can find through our website. Additional information is available through our membership program, which I encourage you all to sign up for to stay up to date on any new developments in .au and also innovations in the digital space. So please sign up through there. We'll also make, I'll circulate again our FAQ document that's on our website that will answer a number of questions I think we've had today. And if you do have specific questions regarding domain name queries, you can put them through via the auDA complaints process or by contacting the registrar direct. A few upcoming events that we have too. For our members in Adelaide, we've got an event on the 26th of October, followed shortly by NetThing, which is supported by auDA once again this year. That's an online web conference. And we've also got a workshop for our .au members with SIN security. The second workshop after the first one was booked out. And also to close off the year, 2 webinars to launch some recent research auDA's done with the support of the Cyber CRC and also our second iteration of our Digital Lives of Australians report. So thank you all for joining us again. To stay up to date, please check out our website or consider joining as a .au member. And we hope to see you all again soon. And thank you for your time, Bruce.
You're welcome, Michael. And thanks everyone for joining.